On a low rise of open grassland between Melbourne and Geelong, not far from the small town of Little River, there is a ring of stones that most Australians have never heard of. There is no car park, there is no visitor centre. Its exact location is deliberately kept quiet. If you drove past it, you would see about 100 lumps of grey basalt sitting in the grass, some no bigger than a football, a few standing up to a metre high. Arranged in a rough egg shape, maybe 50 metres across. You could be forgiven for walking straight past it as a scatter of paddock rocks. But wait until the right evening, stand at the right end of it, and watch where the sun goes down. Because those stones are not scattered, they are aimed. And what they are aimed at is the sky. This place is called Wurdi Youang. It sits on the country of the Wathaurong people, also known as the Wadawurrung. And when astronomers finally sat down and surveyed it properly, they found something that a lot of people were not prepared to believe. That this unassuming ring of basalt on the Victorian plains may be one of the oldest astronomical sites anywhere on Earth. Possibly older than Stonehenge. Possibly older than the pyramids of Giza. Built by people the textbooks long insisted did not build monuments at all. This is Ancient Aussie History, where we go looking for the parts of this country most people never find, and the ancient story most of us were never taught in school. Subscribe now, and if you'd rather listen, every episode is also a podcast on Spotify, link below. And leave a comment telling me whether you'd ever even heard the name Wurdi Youang before today, because I suspect, for most of you, the answer is no. And that is exactly the problem. 100 stones and an egg-shaped ring. Start with what is actually there, because the physical facts matter. Wurdi Youang is an arrangement of roughly 100 basalt boulders, the hard, dark volcanic rock that the whole Victorian volcanic plain is built from, laid out in a distinctive egg-shaped, or oval, ring. The whole thing is around 50 matres along its longer axis, and that axis runs almost exactly east to west. The stones themselves range from small ones you could lift, up to standing stones close to a metre tall, set at the pointed western end of the egg. Altogether, there are something like 23 tons of stone here, gathered, positioned, and set into the ground by hand. And this is the first thing worth sitting with. This is not a natural formation. Basalt does not fall into neat ovals with a hand-placed row of taller stones at one end. Every one of those rocks was chosen and moved and set deliberately by people for a reason. The question that has occupied researchers for decades is a simple one to ask and a very hard one to answer. What was the reason? Why build this out here? And why in this exact shape, pointing in this exact direction? For a long time, the honest answer from mainstream archaeology was a shrug. It was recorded as an Aboriginal stone arrangement, one of many across the country, most of them poorly understood. Rediscovered by surveyors in the 1970s and declared a protected site by the Victorian Archaeological Survey in 1977. It was known, it was catalogued, it was fenced off from harm. But what it was for, nobody had seriously tried to work out. It took an outsider looking at it with a very particular set of eyes to notice what the stones were doing. The man who looked at where the sun sets. In the 1990s, a historian named John Morieson took a close interest in Wurdi Youang and noticed something suggestive. A handful of outlier stones, sitting apart from the main ring at its western end, seemed to point towards the places on the horizon where the sun sets at particular times of the year. Not just anywhere, but at the solstices and the equinox, the turning points of the solar calendar. It was an intriguing idea. It was also exactly the kind of claim that is easy to make and hard to prove, because human beings are very good at seeing patterns in random rock, and a scatter of stones will always seem to point at something if you want it to badly enough, which is why what happened next is so important. In 2008, an astrophysicist named Ray Norris, a professional astronomer, someone who had spent a career measuring the actual positions of objects in the sky, went to Wurdi Youang with his wife Scylla and did what nobody had properly done before. He surveyed it. Precisely. He measured the exact positions of the stones, the exact bearings of the arrangement's straight edges, the exact points on the horizon where the sun would have set at the solstices and equinox, and he checked whether they lined up. And they did. Not vaguely, not approximately. The outlier stones Morieson had flagged aligned with the setting sun at the solstices and the equinox. And, on top of that, the long, straight sides of the egg-shaped ring itself independently pointed to those same solar positions. Two separate sets of indicators, in the one structure, both saying the same thing, ruling out coincidence. If you've made it this far, here's the part that ties it all together, and it's the part that matters most. Subscribe now if you want more of this series, because this is where a paddock full of rocks turns into hard science. Because the obvious objection, the one any sensible person raises, is coincidence. The sun sets somewhere on the horizon every single day. Point enough stones in enough directions and some of them will happen to line up with a solstice or an equinox by pure chance. So how do you tell deliberate design from a lucky accident? You do what Norris did. You test it statistically. His team ran what is called a Monte Carlo simulation. In plain terms, they had a computer generate 10,000 random stone arrangements, scattering fake rocks with no design behind them at all, and then scored how well each random layout matched solar alignments compared to the real Wurdi Youang. Out of 10,000 random arrangements, only about 25 scored as well as, or better than, the real thing. 25 out of 10,000. That is a probability of roughly 0.25% that the alignments at Wurdi Youang happen by chance. Put another way, the odds are overwhelming that the people who built this knew exactly what they were doing. They were not stacking rocks at random. They were marking, in stone, the movement of the sun across the year. The solstices that bracket the longest and shortest days, the equinox that sits between them, with a precision that a modern astrophysicist with survey equipment had to work to confirm. This was a calendar, an observatory, a machine for reading the sky, built out of basalt and knowledge, sitting quietly on a hillside outside Geelong. And it is worth being clear about why that kind of knowledge was not an idle curiosity, but a matter of survival. Knowing exactly where the sun sits in its yearly cycle tells you what the land is about to do. It tells you when particular plants will fruit, when certain animals will move or breed, when the seasons are about to turn, when it is time to travel to a particular place for a particular resource, and when to gather for ceremony. A people living directly off the land, reading it season by season, has every reason to track the solar year with real accuracy. And a fixed structure like Wurdi Youang, aligned once and standing for millennia, turns that knowledge into something permanent and shareable, a reference that does not depend on any single person's memory. It is astronomy put to work. Nor does this sit alone. Across Australia, researchers working with traditional owners have documented a deep and sophisticated body of Aboriginal astronomy. Star knowledge woven into navigation, law, ceremony, and the timing of the seasons, from the great dark shape of the emu in the sky traced through the Milky Way, to traditions that track the rising and setting of specific stars to mark the year. Wurdi Youang is not an isolated freak. It is the most striking, surviving physical monument of a way of watching the sky that stretched right across the continent and back into a past far deeper than anything written down. The number that changes everything. And here is where it stops being merely impressive and becomes genuinely significant because of the one detail that is hardest to pin down: the age. Wurdi Youang has never been directly dated. Stone arrangements are notoriously difficult to date because the rock itself is millions of years old and there is no charcoal, no bone, no organic layer to run through a radiocarbon test. So the honest position is that its exact construction date is unknown, and estimates range enormously, from something recent right back to deep antiquity. But there are serious reasons to think it is very old indeed. Some researchers have suggested it may be more than 11,000 years old. Take that number seriously for a moment and hold it up against the sites we normally reach for when we talk about ancient monuments. Stonehenge, on Salisbury Plain in England, was raised around 5,000 years ago. The Great Pyramid of Giza is roughly 4,500 years old. If the older estimates for Wurdi Youang are anywhere near right, then people were standing on this hill in what is now Victoria, tracking the sun with placed stones, thousands of years before the first sarsen was ever hauled upright at Stonehenge. Thousands of years before anyone in Egypt cut the first block for a pyramid, which would make this modest ring of basalt not just old, but arguably one of the oldest astronomical instruments ever constructed by human beings, anywhere on the planet. And the people who built it were not a lost, vanished civilization. They were the direct ancestors of the Wathaurong, whose descendants are still here, still connected to this country. The Indigenous Land Corporation acquired the site in the year 2000, and in 2006 it was handed back to the Wathaurong Aboriginal Cooperative, the traditional owners, who now care for it and work alongside researchers to understand and protect it. This is not a mystery inherited from strangers, and it is not the work of a culture that disappeared. It is a piece of living heritage, still connected to living people, returned at last to the community it has always belonged to. Why nobody told you about this? So why have most Australians never heard of it? Why does a site that might rival or predate Stonehenge not have a highway sign, a gift shop, a place on every school excursion? Part of the answer is deliberate and good. The exact location is kept quiet, precisely to protect it from vandalism and from being loved to death by crowds. And that is the traditional owner's call to make. But part of it is something less comfortable. And it goes to the heart of why a place like this could sit catalogued and half ignored for so long. For most of the last 2 centuries, the dominant story told about Aboriginal Australians cast them as simple hunter-gatherers, people who moved lightly across the land, who built nothing permanent, who left no monuments. That story was convenient for a colonial project that wanted to treat the continent as effectively empty. And a site like Wurdi Youang does not fit that story at all. A precise solar observatory, engineered out of stone, possibly older than anything in Europe or Egypt, is not the work of people who built nothing. It is the work of people with deep, tested astronomical knowledge, a working understanding of the solar year, and the organisation and intent to record it permanently in the landscape. The reason you were never taught about Wurdi Youang is, in part, that it contradicts a story a lot of people spent a long time telling. What the stones actually prove. None of this needs aliens, and it needs no mystery invented around it. And it is worth saying that plainly, because sites like this attract exactly that kind of nonsense. There is nothing at Wurdi Youang that requires a lost race, or ancient astronauts, or anything from beyond this earth. The truth is more impressive than any of that. What the stones prove is that the people who lived on this country thousands of years ago watched the sky with enough care and consistency to know precisely where the sun would set on the longest day, the shortest day, and the 2 days of perfect balance between. And that they cared enough to build a permanent instrument to mark it, using nothing but basalt, patience, and an astronomical tradition passed down and refined across generations. Stonehenge gets the documentaries, the pyramids get the crowds, and out on a quiet rise near Little River, an egg of grey stone that may be older than either has been sitting in the grass the whole time, aimed at the sunset, waiting for the rest of us to notice what its builders understood all along. The Wadawurrung never lost this knowledge. We simply never bothered to ask them for it. Wurdi Youang is not a puzzle dropped here by someone unknown. It is a signature, left in stone, by the oldest continuous culture on Earth. A reminder that the first astronomers on this continent were watching the heavens with real precision, while most of the world was still a very long way from building anything at all. If this changed how you think about the deep history of this country, leave it in the comments. And subscribe to Ancient Aussie History for more of the strange, ancient, and unresolved corners of this country hiding in plain sight.